Some promises are made in whispers between children who don't understand the weight of their words. Others are forged in moments so pure, so desperate, that they echo across decades like thunder rolling through canyon walls. This is the story of a promise made beside a dying campfire in 1887, when a 10-year-old Apache girl placed her small hand in that of a 12-year-old cowboy and spoke words that would haunt him for 30 years. "I will find you again, Thomas Mitchell. No matter how far you go, no matter how much time passes, I will find you." He thought it was the innocent vow of a child. She knew it was the sacred oath of her people. What happened next would test the boundaries between two worlds that were never meant to meet, challenge everything the frontier taught about love and loyalty, and prove that some bonds are stronger than the forces that try to tear them apart. This is the true story of Sarah Running Bear and Thomas Mitchell, and the promise that brought an Apache woman back from the dead, or so it seemed to everyone who thought they knew what was possible in the American West. The morning sun painted the New Mexico territory in shades of gold and copper when 12-year-old Thomas Mitchell first saw the smoke rising from Devil's Creek. His father's cattle had wandered too far east again, closer to Apache country than any sensible rancher would allow. But the Mitchell family wasn't known for being sensible. They were known for being stubborn, and that morning, Thomas was proving he had inherited every ounce of that particular family trait. The smoke shouldn't have been there. The Army had swept through this area just 2 months ago, Captain Reynolds bragging in town that he'd cleared out every last Apache for 50 miles. But smoke meant fire, and fire meant people, and people in these parts meant trouble for a boy alone with nothing but his grandfather's old colt and a horse that spooked its shadows. Thomas guided his mare, Buttercup, down the rocky slope toward the creek, every instinct his father had beaten into him screaming to turn around. But those cattle represented 3 months of his family's work, and losing them would mean another winter of thin soup and patched clothes. The Mitchell ranch was hanging on by threads already, and those threads were getting thinner every season. The smell hit him first. Not just wood smoke, but something else. Something wrong. When he crested the ridge overlooking the creek, Thomas Mitchell saw his first real glimpse of what the Indian Wars actually meant. The Apache camp had been small, maybe 15 people at most. The Army had found them 2 days ago, judging by the tracks and the condition of the bodies scattered around the cold fire pits. Most of the teepees had been burned, their blackened frames reaching toward the sky like the fingers of buried corpses. Personal belongings lay scattered in the dirt, broken toys and torn clothing and cooking pots with bullet holes through them. Thomas had heard the stories in town, listened to the men talk about Apache raids and massacres, about the necessity of clearing out the hostiles for the good of civilization. But, looking down at a child's doll with its head blown off, he began to understand that there were two sides to every story, and maybe his side wasn't as righteous as he'd been taught to believe. That's when he heard the whimpering. It came from a cluster of rocks near the water, so soft he almost missed it over the sound of the creek. Thomas dismounted and approached carefully, his hand on his pistol but not drawing it. The sound came again, definitely human, definitely young. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, though Apache children often looked smaller than white children of the same age. Her black hair was matted with blood from a gash on her scalp, and her deerskin dress was torn and dirty. She was curled up behind a boulder, clutching something against her chest, her dark eyes watching him with the wariness of a wounded animal. Thomas had never been this close to an Apache before. The stories made them sound like demons, like creatures barely human. But, looking at this frightened little girl, all he could see was someone who reminded him of his younger sister Mary, who had died of fever 3 winters ago. "Hey there," he said softly, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, just pressed herself further back against the rock. Of course she didn't speak English. Why would she? Thomas tried to think of any Apache words he might know, but came up empty. The two cultures lived in the same territory but might as well have been from different planets for all the communication that happened between them. He sat down in the dirt about 10 feet away from her, making himself small and non-threatening. This was how his father had taught him to approach wild animals, to let them come to you instead of forcing the interaction. The girl watched him with intelligent eyes, calculating, deciding. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, she spoke. "You, white boy. Her English was broken but clear, the words carefully pronounced as if she'd been practicing them. "Yes," Thomas said. "I'm white. Are you hurt?" She touched the wound on her head, wincing. "Soldiers come. Kill everyone. I hide." The simple words carried a weight that made Thomas's stomach clench. This little girl had watched her entire family, her entire world, get destroyed. And she was still alive, still hiding, still fighting to survive. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah." "White name. Mother gave me for talking to white people." She clutched whatever she was holding tighter against her chest. "My real name is Nazcha. Means owl. But owl is sacred name. Not for white ears." Thomas nodded, though he didn't fully understand the significance. "I'm Thomas. Thomas Mitchell." "Thomas Mitchell," she repeated, as if memorizing it. "Why you not call soldiers? Why you not kill me?" The question caught him off guard. Why wasn't he? Everything he'd been taught said he should either kill her or take her to the army post. Apache were the enemy. Apache killed white settlers. Apache were a threat to civilization itself. But, looking at this little girl, wounded and alone and speaking to him in careful English learned for the specific purpose of communicating with his people, Thomas couldn't find any enemy to fight. "Because you're just a kid," he said finally. "And you're hurt." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, as if looking for signs of deception. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she slowly extended her hand to show him what she'd been protecting. It was a small carved wooden figure, a horse with intricate designs burned into its sides. Even to Thomas's untrained eye, it was beautiful work, detailed and delicate. "My brother made this. Before soldiers killed him." Her voice was steady, but Thomas could see the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Last thing of family." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, something he wouldn't have words for until years later. It was the moment when the stories he'd been told about Apache savages collided with the reality of a little girl mourning her family, and the stories lost. "It's beautiful," he said, "and mend it." Sarah looked surprised, as if beauty wasn't something she expected white people to recognize in Apache craftsmanship. She tucked the horse back into her dress and winced again as the movement aggravated her head wound. "You need help," Thomas said. "That cut needs cleaning." "No white doctor. They kill me." "Not a doctor." "Me. I know about wounds." It was true. Ranch life meant constant injuries, and Thomas had learned basic medical care out of necessity. "I have clean water and cloth." Sarah considered this for another long moment, then nodded slowly. For the next hour, Thomas cleaned and dressed her wound as best he could with supplies from his saddlebags. Sarah endured the pain stoically, but he could feel her trembling under his hands. When he was finished, she looked up at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. "Why you help enemy?" she asked. "You're not my enemy," Thomas said, and, as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew they were true. "You're just Sarah." Something changed in her face then, some wall coming down. For the first time since he'd found her, she smiled, just a little. "Thomas Mitchell is not like other white men," she said. "Maybe not," he agreed. They sat by the creek for another hour as the sun climbed higher. Sarah told him about her family in broken English mixed with Apache words. Her father had been a medicine man, her mother a skilled weaver. Her brother had been learning to make horses like the one she carried, dreaming of becoming a great artist. They had been part of a peaceful band, she said, trying to stay away from the soldiers and the settlements, just wanting to live quietly in the old way. The soldiers had found them anyway. Thomas told her about his family's ranch, about his father's struggles to keep the cattle fed and safe, about the constant worry about Apache raids that now seemed hollow and one-sided. He found himself apologizing for things he'd never done, for the actions of people he'd never met, for being part of a world that had destroyed hers. "Not your fault," Sarah said quietly. "But is your choice now. What you do with knowing." When the sun reached its peak, Thomas knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't leave her here to die, but he couldn't take her home either. His father would turn her over to the army without question, and the army would either kill her or send her to one of the reservation schools where Apache children went to die slowly instead of all at once. "There's a mission," he said finally. "Father Martinez. About 20 miles south. He helps people. All people." Sarah nodded. She'd heard of the priest who treated Apache and Mexican and white equally, who asked no questions about the past. "You take me there?" "Yes," Thomas said, though he knew it would mean abandoning his search for the cattle, facing his father's anger, and probably getting the beating of his life. "I'll take you there." They buried what remained of Sarah's family that afternoon. Thomas had never seen Apache burial customs before, had never participated in any ritual outside his own Protestant upbringing. But Sarah guided him through it with a solemnity that made every movement feel sacred. She sang something in Apache, her young voice carrying across the empty landscape, and Thomas found himself crying for people he'd never met but somehow felt he'd known. When it was finished, Sarah turned to him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Thomas Mitchell," she said, taking his hands in her smaller ones. "I make promise to you. Sacred promise of my people. You don't need to promise me anything, Sarah." "Yes. I do." Her dark eyes held his blue ones without wavering. "Someday, I come back to you. When I am grown, when I am strong, I come find you. No matter how far you go, no matter how much time passes, I will find you again." Thomas felt something electric pass between their joined hands, something that made the hair on his arms stand up. It felt like more than words, like something being sealed or sworn that couldn't be taken back. "I will find you again, Thomas Mitchell. And, when I do, you will understand why the spirits brought us together in this place, at this time." She kissed his forehead then, quickly and shyly, and Thomas felt branded by the touch. "I'll remember," he said, though he thought it was the kind of promise children make before they learn how the world really works. The ride to Father Martinez's mission took 2 days. They traveled carefully, avoiding main trails and keeping to the high ground where they could see anyone coming from miles away. Sarah rode behind Thomas on Buttercup, her arms around his waist, the wooden horse pressed between them. They talked constantly, Sarah's English improving by the hour as if proximity to Thomas was unlocking something in her mind. She told him stories of her people, legends about coyotes and spirits and the time before white men came. He told her about books and schools and the life he imagined for himself beyond the ranch. On the second night, camped in a hidden canyon with a tiny fire for warmth, Sarah asked him something that would echo in his mind for 30 years. "Thomas Mitchell, when you are man grown, what you want most in world?" He thought about it seriously, this 12-year-old boy who had seen too much in the past few days. "I want to matter," he said finally. "I want my life to count for something good." Sarah nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected, the answer that confirmed something she'd already decided. "Your life will matter," she said with absolute certainty. "You will do great things. I see it in you, like my father could see things that had not yet happened. You have good heart, Thomas Mitchell. Good hearts always find their purpose." Father Martinez was a small, kind man with gentle eyes and work-worn hands. He asked no questions when Thomas arrived with the Apache girl, simply welcomed them both and set about treating Sarah's wounds properly. The mission was a haven of sorts, a place where the rules of the outside world seemed temporarily suspended. When it came time to leave, Thomas felt as if he was tearing part of himself away. Sarah walked him to his horse, her head properly bandaged now, wearing a simple dress the priest had found for her. "You sure you'll be all right here?" Thomas asked. "Father Martinez is good man. He will help me." She touched his face with her small hand. "But, remember promise, Thomas Mitchell. I come back to you. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year. But, I come back." "I'll remember," he said, and this time he meant it. Thomas rode away from the mission without looking back, afraid that if he did, he might never leave. Behind him, Sarah running bare watched until he disappeared over the horizon, her hand pressed to the wooden horse hidden beneath her dress, already planning for a future that seemed impossible to everyone except her. 30 years later, when a beautiful Apache woman walked into his bank in Silver City and spoke his name, Thomas Mitchell would remember every word of that promise, and, finally, understand that some bonds are stronger than time, stronger than distance, stronger than all the forces that try to keep two worlds apart. But, that morning, riding home to face his father's anger and his own uncertain future, Thomas was just a boy who had learned that enemies could become friends, that courage could be quiet and small, and that sometimes the most important promises are the ones that seem impossible to keep. The beating Thomas expected from his father turned out to be nothing compared to the silence that followed. Henry Mitchell was a man who expressed disappointment through withdrawal, and, for 3 weeks after Thomas returned from Devil's Creek with tales of lost cattle and a vague story about getting turned around in Apache country, his father barely spoke to him. Thomas didn't tell anyone about Sarah. Not his father, not his mother, not even his best friend Jake Henderson when Jake pressed him for details about his 2-day absence. Something about that promise, about those moments by the creek, felt too sacred to share with people who wouldn't understand. In a territory where Apache meant enemy and enemy meant kill or be killed, Thomas had discovered that the world was far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. The wooden horse Sarah had shown him haunted his dreams. In sleep, he would see her small hands carving intricate designs into the wood, see her brother teaching her the old patterns, see the pride in her father's eyes as his children learned the traditions of their people. He would wake with the taste of smoke in his mouth and the echo of her voice promising to return. As summer turned to autumn, Thomas threw himself into ranch work with an intensity that surprised his parents. He repaired fences that didn't need repairing, rode patrol routes that had been safe for months, and spent long hours in the evening teaching himself to read and write better than the basic skills his mother had managed to pass along. Something was driving him forward, some sense that he needed to be ready for something important, though he couldn't have said what. Boys growing up fast, his mother mentioned to his father one evening as Thomas sat by lamplight, struggling through a book of poetry he'd borrowed from the preacher. Maybe too fast, Henry replied, but there was approval in his voice. The truth was that Thomas Mitchell was becoming a young man with a foot in two worlds, though only he knew it. The encounter with Sarah had cracked something open inside him, some capacity for understanding that people were people regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. It was a dangerous understanding in 1887 New Mexico, but it was growing stronger every day. 20 miles south, Sarah Running Bear was undergoing her own transformation under Father Martinez's gentle guidance. The mission was a strange place, populated by Mexican farmers, a few reformed outlaws, some Apache who had chosen conversion over the reservation, and an endless stream of travelers seeking help or shelter. It was Father Martinez's policy that anyone who came in peace could stay, and somehow this impossible mixture of people had formed something resembling a community. Sarah learned to read and write in both English and Spanish within 6 months, her quick mind absorbing languages the way desert sand absorbs water. Father Martinez, who had been educated in Mexico City before accepting this remote posting, recognized her intelligence immediately and began teaching her mathematics, history, and geography along with the religious instruction expected of his charges. But Sarah's most important education came from listening to the stories of the adults around her. The Mexican farmers told her about losing their land to American expansion, about families separated and communities destroyed. The former outlaws spoke of justice and injustice, of how good men could be driven to bad choices by circumstances beyond their control. The other Apache shared their own tales of loss and survival, of watching their world disappear piece by piece. Through it all, Sarah came to understand that what had happened to her family was part of something much larger, a collision of cultures that left casualties on all sides. But, unlike many who learned this lesson, Sarah didn't let it make her bitter. Instead, it made her determined to find another way forward. Hate is easy, Father Martinez told her one evening as they worked together in his small garden. Forgiveness is hard. But, forgiveness is the only thing that builds instead of destroying. I don't hate Thomas Mitchell, Sarah replied, carefully transplanting a seedling. He chose kindness when he could have chosen cruelty. And, what will you choose when you see him again? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands working automatically in the rich soil. I will choose to show him that his kindness mattered. That it changed something. Father Martinez smiled. In the year Sarah had been at the mission, he had watched her grow from a traumatized child into something remarkable, someone who carried the wisdom of her people alongside new knowledge from the wider world. He suspected that Thomas Mitchell, whoever he was, had no idea what was coming his way. As Sarah learned and grew at the mission, Thomas was having his own awakening to the complexities of life on the frontier. The cattle business was struggling territory-wide, hit by drought, falling prices, and increasing competition from larger operations back east. The Mitchell Ranch, already operating on thin margins, was sliding toward bankruptcy with no clear way to recover. But Thomas was also beginning to understand that there were opportunities for those willing to think beyond traditional ways of doing business. The territorial capital was growing, new towns were being established, and the railroad was pushing through with promises of connecting the remote Southwest to the booming markets of California and the East Coast. Smart men who could read the changes coming would prosper. Those who couldn't would disappear. On his 16th birthday, Thomas told his parents he wanted to learn banking. Banking? His father nearly choked on his coffee. "Son, we're ranchers. Have been for 3 generations. And we're about to be the last generation if we don't adapt," Thomas replied with a firmness that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "I want to understand money, Pa. How it works, how it moves, how people who have it think. Because those are the people who are going to decide what happens to places like this." It was a remarkably mature insight for a 16-year-old cowboy, but Thomas Mitchell had been thinking like a man since the day he found a wounded Apache girl and chose compassion over fear. His parents were skeptical but not stupid. They could see the writing on the wall as clearly as anyone. If their son thought he could find a path forward that they couldn't see, maybe they should let him try. Through the preacher's connections, Thomas secured an apprenticeship with the First Bank of Santa Fe, 100 miles north of the ranch. It meant leaving home, leaving the only life he'd ever known, but Thomas felt drawn toward something he couldn't name. Some sense that he needed to be in a position to help people when they needed help most. The first letter Sarah wrote to him found its way to the ranch 6 months after he'd left for Santa Fe. His mother forwarded it without reading it, though she was curious about who might be writing to her son from Father Martinez's mission. Thomas opened the letter in his small boarding house room, hands trembling as he recognized the careful handwriting he'd watched develop during those 2 days together. "Dear Thomas Mitchell," it began. "I hope this letter finds you well and happy. Father Martinez has taught me to write in English, and you are the first person I wanted to practice with. I think of you often and remember your kindness to a frightened girl by the creek. I am learning many things here. How to read, how to write, how to understand the world beyond my people's traditional ways. But I never forget the most important thing you taught me, that kindness can exist between different peoples when we choose to see each other as human beings first." The letter went on to describe her life at the mission, her studies, her growing understanding of the complex world they both inhabited. But it was the closing that made Thomas's breath catch. "I have not forgotten my promise to you, Thomas Mitchell. Every day I prepare myself to be worthy of finding you again. I hope that when that day comes, you will remember the girl you saved, and perhaps understand why the spirits brought us together. Until then, I remain your friend across all distances, Sarah Running Bear." Thomas read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it in the small wooden box where he kept his most important possessions. Sarah Running Bear. She had never told him her full name, but somehow it fit perfectly. He wrote back immediately, telling her about his banking apprenticeship, about his growing understanding of finance and business, about his hopes for the future. He told her about his small room above the barbershop, about the books he was reading, about the way Santa Fe was changing as more Eastern money flowed west. But, mostly, he told her that he did remember, that he would always remember, and that he looked forward to the day when she would fulfill her promise. The correspondence that followed would span 7 years, 2 people growing up in letters across the geographic and cultural divide that separated their worlds. Sarah wrote about her studies, her growing fluency in multiple languages, her deepening understanding of both Apache traditions and the broader world beyond the Southwest. Thomas shared his advancement in banking, his growing expertise in territorial law and land rights, his increasing awareness of how money and power shaped the fate of ordinary people. Neither of them spoke directly about the feelings that were growing between them, the sense that their lives were somehow intertwined in ways neither fully understood. But it was there in every letter, in the careful attention to details that only someone special would care about, in the way they both saved every piece of correspondence and read them over and over during lonely moments. Sarah was becoming a remarkable woman, fluent in 4 languages, educated in European literature and history, skilled in traditional Apache crafts and modern business practices. Father Martinez had connections throughout the Southwest, and he had quietly begun preparing Sarah for a larger role in the world, though he never spoke of it directly. Thomas was growing into exactly the kind of man Sarah had glimpsed in that 12-year-old boy by the creek. Fair, intelligent, compassionate, but with a steel core that couldn't be bent by pressure or threat. His reputation in Santa Fe banking circles was growing, particularly his unusual willingness to make loans to Mexican farmers and small business owners who couldn't get credit elsewhere. Young Mitchell has strange ideas about banking, his supervisor mentioned to a colleague one day. Thinks we should be helping people instead of just making money off them. Dangerous thinking in a banker, the colleague replied. Maybe. Or maybe it's the future. Kid seems to make money even when he's being generous. That's a rare talent. By 1894, Thomas had saved enough money to open his own bank in Silver City, a booming mining town that needed financial services for its growing population of entrepreneurs and dreamers. The Bank of Silver City was small but well-run, known for fair dealing and creative solutions to complex problems. Sarah's letters came regularly now, sometimes twice a month, filled with observations about the changing world and hints about her own future plans. She was 27 years old, an adult woman who had somehow managed to get an education that rivaled anything available to white women in the territory, while never losing touch with her Apache heritage. Father Martinez was aging, and the mission was struggling financially. Sarah had begun taking on more responsibilities, essentially running the day-to-day operations while the old priest focused on spiritual matters. But Thomas could sense in her letters that she was preparing for something else, something she hadn't yet shared with him. The answer came in a letter dated October 15, 1894. Dear Thomas, it began, and he noticed immediately that she had dropped his last name, a small intimacy that made his pulse quicken. The time has come for me to fulfill the promise I made to a brave boy beside Devil's Creek 7 years ago. Father Martinez has arranged for me to travel to Silver City next month to meet with potential benefactors for the mission. But, truly, I am coming to see you. To discover whether the man you have become still recognizes the girl you saved, and whether the bond we forged in those desperate hours has grown into something that can bridge the gap between our worlds. If you are willing to see me, I will be staying at the Continental Hotel beginning November 3rd. If you are not, I will understand and trouble you no more. But, I hope, Thomas Mitchell, that your heart tells you the same thing mine tells me, that some promises are meant to be kept, and some meetings are meant to change everything. Thomas read the letter sitting in his office, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows of his small but prosperous bank. Outside, Silver City hummed with activity, miners and merchants and dreamers all chasing their fortunes in the mountains of New Mexico. Inside, Thomas Mitchell held a letter that promised to change his life forever, and wondered if he was brave enough to let it happen. The woman who had signed that letter was no longer the wounded child he'd found by the creek. Sarah Running Bear had become someone remarkable, educated, sophisticated, and carrying within her the strength of 2 cultures. In 3 weeks, she would walk through the doors of his bank and speak his name, and everything he thought he knew about his life would have to be reconsidered. But, first, he had to decide whether he was ready to discover what she had become, and what they might become together. November 3, 1894, dawned crisp and clear in Silver City, one of those perfect autumn mornings when the air seemed to sparkle with possibility. Thomas Mitchell had been awake since before sunrise, standing at his bedroom window above the bank, watching the street below come to life and wondering if this would be the day that changed everything. He had read Sarah's letter at least 50 times in the past 3 weeks, memorizing every word, every curve of her careful handwriting. The Continental Hotel was just 2 blocks away from his bank, close enough that he could see the front entrance from his office window. Close enough that he had been distracted from work for days, catching himself staring down the street, wondering if each female figure in the distance might be her. At 36 years old, Thomas had never married, though not for lack of opportunities. Silver City's growing prosperity had brought eligible women from back east, educated ladies who would have made suitable wives for a successful banker. His mother wrote regularly asking when he planned to settle down and give her grandchildren. His business associates occasionally joked about his bachelor status, wondering what he was waiting for. Only Thomas knew he had been waiting for a promise made by a 10-year-old Apache girl beside a creek where her family lay dead. The morning passed with agonizing slowness. Thomas tried to concentrate on paperwork, on reviewing loan applications and meeting with clients, but his attention kept drifting to the window. Several times he thought he saw her, his heart jumping before disappointment set in when the woman turned out to be someone else entirely. At 11:30, Mrs. Henderson came into the bank to make a deposit, chattering as usual about the latest gossip. "Did you see that Indian woman who checked into the Continental yesterday?" she asked while Thomas counted out her bills. "Beautiful as anything, but strange. Dressed like a lady, speaks perfect English, but you can tell she's Apache. Makes a person wonder what she's doing in Silver City." Thomas's hands stilled on the currency. Indian woman? Oh yes. Quite striking, actually. Maria Rodriguez was working at the hotel yesterday and said she's never seen anything like her. Polite as you please, well-dressed, but with those dark eyes that see right through you. Maria said it gave her the shivers. Did she mention why she was here? Something about mission business, I believe. Though what kind of mission business brings an Apache woman to Silver City is beyond me. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially. Some folks are saying she might be one of those educated Indians from back east, come to stir up trouble with the local tribes. Thomas forced his expression to remain neutral, though his pulse was racing. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about, Mrs. Henderson. Silver City welcomes all peaceful visitors. After Mrs. Henderson left, Thomas found himself pacing his office, unable to concentrate on anything. Sarah was here. After 7 years of letters, after 3 decades of wondering what had become of the wounded girl by the creek, she was less than 200 yards away. The question was what to do about it. Part of him wanted to walk immediately to the Continental Hotel and ask for her room number. Part of him wanted to wait, to let her make the first move as her letter had suggested. And a small, frightened part of him wondered if he was making a terrible mistake that would complicate both their lives in ways he couldn't imagine. The decision was taken out of his hands at exactly 12:15, when the bank's front door opened and Sarah Running Bear walked into his life for the second time. Thomas looked up from his desk as his clerk announced a visitor, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She was beautiful, but that was the least remarkable thing about her. The 10-year-old girl had grown into a woman of stunning presence, someone who commanded attention not through flash or artifice but through an almost regal bearing that spoke of inner strength and absolute confidence in her own worth. Her black hair was arranged in an elegant style that would have been fashionable in San Francisco or Denver, and her dark blue dress was perfectly tailored and expensively made. Her jewelry was subtle but distinctive, silver work that was unmistakably Apache in design but executed with an artistry that elevated it to the level of fine art. But it was her eyes that stopped Thomas's breath. They were the same dark, intelligent eyes that had watched him beside Devil's Creek, but matured now, holding depths of knowledge and experience that spoke of a remarkable life lived fully. "Hello, Thomas Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying just a trace of the musical cadence he remembered from their childhood correspondence. "I told you I would find you again." Thomas rose slowly from his chair, aware that his clerk and the 2 customers in the bank were watching this exchange with fascination. The successful banker and the mysterious Apache woman made an intriguing tableau, one that would be discussed in Silver City drawing rooms for weeks to come. "Sarah," he said, her name feeling both foreign and familiar on his lips. "You came." "I always keep my promises," she replied, and he could hear 30 years of determination in those simple words. They stood looking at each other across the polished floor of his bank, 2 people who had shared something profound as children and who were now discovering what they had become as adults. The moment stretched between them, electric with possibility and weighted with all the complications their renewed connection would bring. "Would you like to talk privately?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward his office. "I would like that very much." Thomas instructed his clerk to handle any routine business and escorted Sarah into his private office, closing the door behind them. The space suddenly seemed smaller, more intimate, charged with an energy that made the air itself seem to shimmer. "Please, sit," Thomas offered, indicating the chair across from his desk. Sarah settled herself gracefully, her movements economical and precise. Everything about her spoke of careful education and natural refinement, but underneath that polish, Thomas could still sense the strength and wildness that had kept a 10-year-old girl alive in the aftermath of massacre. "You've done well for yourself," Sarah observed, looking around the well-appointed office with its law books, financial documents, and certificates of achievement. "Father Martinez always said you would. He had a gift for seeing people's potential." "How is Father Martinez?" "Aging gracefully, still fighting the good fight. The mission continues to serve those who need help, though we struggle for funding." She paused, studying his face. "You've changed, Thomas. The boy I knew has become a man of substance." "And you've become remarkable," Thomas replied honestly. "Your letters over the years hinted at it, but seeing you now. Sarah, you're extraordinary." A slight smile touched her lips. "I had good teachers. And I had a promise to keep." The weight of that promise hung between them, all the implications neither had fully discussed in their careful correspondence. Thomas leaned back in his chair, trying to process what her presence meant, what she was really asking of him. "Why now?" he asked gently. "Why come now, after all these years?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on something beyond the windows of his office. When she spoke, her voice carried a gravity that made Thomas understand this was not a casual decision. "Because the world is changing, Thomas. The old ways are disappearing, on both sides. My people are being pushed onto reservations, losing their language, their traditions, their connection to the land. Your people are building railroads and telegraphs and cities, reaching toward a future that has no room for anything that doesn't fit into neat categories." She turned her gaze back to him, and he saw pain there, but also determination. "I spent 7 years at the mission learning to live between worlds. I can speak to Mexican farmers in Spanish, to Apache elders in our traditional language, to Eastern businessmen in their own terms. I understand law and finance and politics, but I also know the old songs and the sacred stories. I know how to negotiate with government officials and how to prepare traditional medicines. I am, in many ways, exactly what this territory needs as it transforms from frontier to statehood." Thomas began to understand the magnitude of what she was suggesting. "You're talking about building bridges. Being a translator between cultures." "Yes. But I can't do it alone. I need partners, allies, people who understand that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conquest." She leaned forward slightly, her intensity palpable. "I need someone who proved 30 years ago that he could look beyond the color of a person's skin and see their humanity." The implications of her words settled over Thomas like sunrise over mountains, illuminating a landscape he hadn't known existed. She wasn't just fulfilling a childhood promise. She was proposing a partnership that could reshape the future of the Southwest. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah reached into her small purse and withdrew a familiar object, the carved wooden horse her brother had made, now polished smooth by decades of handling. "I'm asking you to help me save what can be saved, Thomas. To use your influence, your understanding of finance and law, to protect Apache families who want to maintain their culture while learning to navigate the modern world. To help establish businesses and schools and medical facilities that serve everyone, not just white settlers. To prove that integration doesn't have to mean elimination." She placed the wooden horse on his desk between them, a bridge across 30 years and 2 very different worlds. "I'm asking you to help me build something new. Something that honors the past while embracing the future. Something that your 12-year-old self dreamed of when he chose kindness over fear." Thomas picked up the carved horse, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the intricate details that spoke of patient artistry and deep love. This small object had traveled through decades of hope and loss, had been clutched by a dying child and, polished by a determined woman, had somehow become a symbol of everything he had once believed was possible. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "There are people on both sides who profit from keeping things the way they are. Politicians who build careers on fear, businessmen who get rich on conflict, Apache leaders who see any cooperation as betrayal. Nothing worthwhile is ever easy, Sarah replied. But we have advantages they don't expect. You understand how money really works, how to make change profitable for the right people. I understand both cultures intimately, know how to speak to different groups in their own language. Together, we can find solutions that seem impossible to people who only see one side. Thomas stood and walked to his window, looking out at the bustling street below. Silver City was growing rapidly, drawing people from all over the country who were seeking new opportunities in the West. Most of them came with the assumption that Apache meant enemy, that the only good Indian was either a dead Indian or one safely confined to a reservation. But, standing in his office was living proof that the world was more complex and more hopeful than those assumptions allowed. There's something else, Sarah said quietly, and Thomas turned back to see her watching him with an expression that made his heart race. Something I haven't said in any of my letters because some things can only be spoken face to face. What is it? Sarah stood and moved closer to him, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of sage and wildflowers that clung to her hair, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. The promise I made by the creek wasn't just about finding you again, Thomas. It was about discovering whether what I felt as a child had grown into something deeper. Whether the bond between us was strong enough to overcome every obstacle the world might place in our path. She reached up and touched his face with the same gentle gesture she had used 30 years ago, and Thomas felt time collapse around them. I love you, she said simply. I have loved you since I was 10 years old, and you showed me that kindness was possible in the darkest hour. I love the man you've become, the life you've built, the dreams you still carry. I love you enough to risk everything by coming here, by speaking these words that can't be taken back. Thomas covered her hand with his own, holding it against his cheek, feeling the warmth and softness and strength of her touch. Sarah, he whispered, her name a prayer and a promise and a declaration all at once. If you can love me in return, she continued, if you're brave enough to face what our partnership would mean, what our love would cost both of us, then we can change the world together. Not just through business and politics, but through proving that love is stronger than hate, that understanding is more powerful than fear. Thomas looked into her eyes and saw his own future reflected there, challenging and complicated and absolutely right in a way that made every other path seem like a pale imitation of real living. I've been waiting for you my whole life, he said, and meant it completely. Every decision I've made, every door I've opened, every bridge I've built has been preparing me for this moment. For you. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place he'd never been but had always belonged, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't known was incomplete. Outside, Silver City continued its busy afternoon routine, unaware that in a small bank office, two people were discovering that some promises are worth keeping no matter how long it takes, and that love really can bridge any gap if you're willing to build the bridge one careful stone at a time. The news of Thomas Mitchell's involvement with the Apache woman spread through Silver City faster than wildfire in dry grass. Within hours of Sarah's visit to his bank, tongues were wagging in every parlor, saloon, and shop in town. By evening, the story had grown and twisted in the telling until it bore little resemblance to reality, but the core truth remained shocking enough to divide the community into hostile camps. Thomas discovered the extent of the problem when he arrived at his usual restaurant for dinner and found himself eating alone for the first time in months. Conversation stopped when he entered, resumed in whispers when he passed, and he could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him from every corner of the room. The next morning brought a delegation of Silver City's leading citizens to his office, their faces grim with purpose. Mayor Harrison led the group, flanked by Judge Morrison, banker Jameson from the competing First National, and three prominent merchants who had previously been friendly acquaintances. Thomas, Mayor Harrison began without preamble, we need to talk. Thomas gestured to the chairs in his office, though there weren't enough seats for everyone. The men arranged themselves in a semicircle that felt more like a tribunal than a social visit. We're concerned, Judge Morrison said bluntly, about your association with the Apache woman. Her name is Sarah Running Bear, Thomas replied calmly, though his pulse was quickening. And I'm not sure why my personal associations are anyone's business but my own. When those associations threaten the stability of our community, they become everyone's business, banker Jameson interjected. His face was flushed with indignation. Thomas, you're a respected businessman in this town. People look to you for leadership, for sound judgment. What message does it send when you're seen courting a savage? The word hit Thomas like a physical blow, but he kept his voice level. Miss Running Bear is one of the most educated, refined women I've ever met. She speaks 4 languages, has studied literature and history, and demonstrates more grace and intelligence than most people in this room. She's still Apache, Mayor Harrison said flatly. And Apache means trouble. Always has, always will. The folks here have worked hard to build something safe and prosperous. They won't stand for anything that threatens that. Threatens it how? Thomas demanded. By challenging your assumptions? By proving that Apache people are human beings with the same hopes and dreams as anyone else? By stirring up the locals, Judge Morrison replied. By giving ideas to Apache still living wild in the mountains. By making our people look weak and foolish to outsiders who are watching to see if we can handle our own affairs. Thomas looked around the circle of faces, seeing fear and prejudice disguised as practical concern. These were good men in many ways, pillars of the community who genuinely cared about Silver City's future. But they were also products of their time and place, shaped by decades of conflict and propaganda that painted all Apache as irredeemable enemies. What exactly are you asking me to do? He asked quietly. End it, Mayor Harrison said. Whatever this relationship is, end it now. Send her back where she came from before this gets out of hand. And if I refuse? The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Finally, Banker Jameson spoke up. Thomas, you're a smart man. You understand how business works, how reputation affects success. We're not threatening you, but we can't protect you from the consequences of your choices. It was a threat disguised as friendly advice, and everyone in the room knew it. Thomas's bank depended on the goodwill of the community, on deposits from local businesses and loans to area ranchers. If these men decided to make his life difficult, they could destroy everything he'd built. After the delegation left, Thomas sat alone in his office, staring at the wooden horse Sarah had left on his desk. Outside, Silver City bustled with normal activity, but he could feel the undercurrent of tension that his relationship with Sarah had unleashed. People were choosing sides, and he was discovering that standing on principle was more complicated than he'd imagined as a 12-year-old boy. That evening, he met Sarah for dinner at the Continental Hotel, one of the few establishments in town that would serve them both. The dining room was nearly empty, though Thomas suspected that was by design rather than coincidence. You've heard, Sarah said as soon as she saw his face. The mayor and his friends paid me a visit. They want me to end our association before it causes more problems. Sarah nodded as if she'd expected this. And what did you tell them? That it's none of their business. But, Sarah, they can make things very difficult for both of us if we continue down this path. Are you having second thoughts? Her voice was calm, but Thomas could see the vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. Thomas reached across the table and took her hands in his, not caring who might be watching from the kitchen or the lobby. No, he said firmly. No second thoughts. But I want you to understand what we're facing. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everything people in this territory believe about Apache, about mixing races, about the kind of future they want to build. I know, Sarah replied softly. Thomas, I've lived my entire adult life navigating between worlds that don't want to understand each other. I know the costs of loving across those boundaries. The question is whether you're prepared to pay them. Before Thomas could answer, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected ally. Colonel James Morrison, Judge Morrison's younger brother and a retired cavalry officer, entered the dining room and approached their table with a directness that suggested he'd come with a purpose. Mr. Mitchell, Miss Running Bear, he said with a respectful nod. I wonder if I might join you for a moment. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances, then Thomas gestured to an empty chair. Colonel Morrison was a respected figure in Silver City, a man whose military service had earned him credibility that even his brother's political position couldn't match. I'll be direct, the colonel began after taking his seat. I've heard about the pressure you're facing, Thomas, and I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town agrees with the approach being taken." This was surprising news. Colonel Morrison had fought Apache during his military service and was known for his strong opinions about territorial security. "I've fought Apache warriors," he continued, "but I've also fought alongside Apache scouts. I've seen what your people are capable of, Miss Running Bear, both in war and in peace. Intelligence, courage, loyalty, tactical brilliance. The idea that such people are somehow inferior is not just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid." Sarah inclined her head gracefully. "Thank you, Colonel Morrison. It's rare to hear such honesty from someone who has seen both sides of the conflict. The truth is," Morrison went on, "this territory is going to need all the help it can get to transition from frontier to statehood. People who can bridge different communities, who understand multiple perspectives, who can help everyone move forward together instead of remaining trapped in old patterns of conflict. What you two are proposing, working together across cultural lines, that's not just admirable. It's necessary." Thomas felt a surge of hope. "Are you saying you support our relationship?" "I'm saying I support practical solutions to complicated problems. And I'm saying you have more allies than you might think." Morrison leaned forward conspiratorially. "There's a group of us, business owners and professionals, who think Silver City's future depends on being more inclusive, not less. We've been watching what you've built here, Thomas, how you've made banking work for people the other institutions wouldn't touch. We think that model could be expanded." "Expanded how?" Sarah asked. "Economic development that includes everyone. Apache crafts marketed to Eastern buyers. Agricultural cooperation between white ranchers and Apache farmers. Shared educational resources. Business partnerships that benefit all communities." Morrison's eyes were bright with enthusiasm. "Miss Running Bear, your education and cultural knowledge, combined with Thomas's financial expertise and community standing, could be the foundation for something entirely new in territorial development." For the next hour, Colonel Morrison outlined a vision that was both ambitious and practical. A coalition of forward-thinking citizens who wanted to build a different kind of future, one that proved cooperation was more profitable than conflict. It wasn't just about romance or principle, though those mattered. It was about economic development and political stability, about creating model communities that the territorial government would want to support rather than suppress. "The key," Morrison explained, "is making it profitable for the right people. Thomas, your bank could finance Apache-owned businesses. Sarah, your connections could open markets we've never accessed. Together, you could demonstrate that integration isn't just morally right, it's financially successful." When Morrison left, Thomas and Sarah sat in the now empty dining room, processing what they'd heard. "He's offering us a way forward," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Not just as individuals, but as partners in something larger." "It's risky," Thomas replied. "If it fails, we'll both be ruined. If it succeeds, we'll have enemies who will never forgive us for proving them wrong." "Everything worthwhile is risky," Sarah pointed out. "The question is whether we're brave enough to try." Thomas thought about the delegation that had visited his office, about the social pressure and financial threats that would only increase if he continued on this path. Then, he thought about the 12-year-old boy who had chosen kindness over fear beside Devil's Creek, and realized that boy was still inside him, still believing that the right choice was worth any cost. "I'm brave enough," he said. "The question is whether Silver City is ready for what we're going to build." The answer to that question came sooner than expected. The next morning brought news that would test everyone's commitment to the future they were trying to create. A band of Apache raiders had attacked a ranch 30 miles south of town, killing 2 cowhands and stealing horses. It was the first Apache violence in the area for over a year, and it couldn't have come at a worse time for Thomas and Sarah's efforts at reconciliation. By noon, an angry crowd had gathered in front of the bank, their voices rising in demands for justice and action. Someone had started a rumor that Sarah was connected to the raiders, that she had been gathering intelligence during her stay in Silver City. Another voice claimed that Thomas was providing financial support to hostile Apache through his banking connections. Neither accusation had any basis in fact, but facts had little power when fear and prejudice were running high. Thomas stood at his office window, watching the crowd grow larger and more agitated. Sarah was beside him, her face calm but her hands clenched with tension. "They want someone to blame," she said quietly. "And we're convenient targets." "We could leave," Thomas offered, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "Take the afternoon stage to Santa Fe, wait for things to cool down." Sarah turned to look at him, and he saw in her eyes the same steel he'd glimpsed in the 10-year-old girl by the creek. "Thomas Mitchell," she said with a slight smile, "if you think I'm going to run from a mob after waiting 30 years to find you again, you don't know me as well as you think you do." Outside, the crowd was getting louder, more organized. Someone was making a speech about protecting the community from traitors and savage lovers. Thomas could see Sheriff Williams making his way through the crowd, his face grim with the knowledge that he was facing a situation that could explode into violence at any moment. "Then, we stand and fight," Thomas said, reaching for Sarah's hand. "Together." "Together," she agreed, and, in that moment, Thomas knew that whatever happened next, he had found something worth defending with everything he had. Sheriff Williams reached the bank just as the crowd began chanting for Thomas and Sarah to show themselves. The sheriff was a fair man, but he was also practical, and he could see that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to control through normal law enforcement methods. Thomas made the decision before anyone could stop him. He opened the front door of the bank and stepped outside, Sarah beside him, facing a crowd of perhaps 60 angry citizens who represented everything wrong with the territory's approach to Apache relations. "That's enough!" Thomas shouted over the noise, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent years dealing with difficult situations. The crowd quieted slightly, more from surprise than respect. "You want to talk about loyalty to this community?" Thomas continued. "Let's talk about it. I've lived here for 8 years. I've made loans to half the people in this crowd when other banks wouldn't give you the time of day. I've supported local businesses, hired local workers, and helped build the prosperity you're all so worried about protecting. That don't give you the right to consort with savages," someone shouted from the back. "This woman," Thomas said, gesturing to Sarah, "has more education than anyone in this crowd. She speaks 4 languages, understands law and finance better than most lawyers, and has dedicated her life to finding ways for different peoples to live together peacefully. If that makes her a savage, then I'm proud to stand with savages." The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't the defensive response they'd expected. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled group. "My name is Sarah Running Bear," she said with dignity that cut through the anger like a blade. 30 years ago, soldiers killed my family beside Devil's Creek. I was 10 years old, wounded and alone, with every reason to hate all white people for the rest of my life." The crowd had gone completely silent now, drawn into her story despite themselves. "But a 12-year-old white boy found me that day. He could have killed me, or turned me over to the soldiers, or simply walked away and let me die. Instead, he chose kindness. He cleaned my wounds, shared his food, and risked his own safety to get me to people who could help. That boy was Thomas Mitchell." A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't the story they'd heard in the saloons and shops. "For 30 years, I have prepared myself to return to him, to find out what kind of man he had become, and to offer him partnership in building something better than the hatred that destroyed my family. Today, some of you want to drive us apart because you're afraid of change, afraid of acknowledging that Apache people are human beings with the same hopes and dreams as yourselves." Sarah's eyes swept the crowd, making contact with individuals, personalizing her message. "But I want you to know something about the Apache raid yesterday. Those raiders came from a band that has refused all contact with missions, with government officials, with anyone trying to find peaceful solutions. They represent the old way, the way of endless war and mutual destruction. Thomas and I represent a different way, the way of cooperation and shared prosperity." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You have a choice to make today. You can choose fear, and drive away the very people who might help you build lasting peace. Or you can choose courage, and support efforts to find solutions that work for everyone." For a long moment, the crowd wavered, balanced between the prejudices that had brought them here and the undeniable power of Sarah's words and presence. Then, Colonel Morrison pushed through from the back of the crowd, followed by a dozen other men Thomas recognized as successful business owners and community leaders. "Miss Running Bear is right," Morrison announced in his command voice. "And I'll tell you something else. The Apache who attacked the Walker Ranch yesterday were arrested this morning by tribal police and turned over to territorial authorities. Tribal police led by Apache who believe in the rule of law, who want peace as much as we do." This was news to everyone, including Thomas. Morrison continued before anyone could interrupt. "The Apache community is no more united in support of raiders than the white community is united in support of every outlaw who happens to share our skin color. There are Apache who want war, and Apache who want peace. The question is which ones we choose to work with." Dr. Hamilton, the town's physician, stepped forward from Morrison's group. "I've had occasion to work with Miss Running Bear over the past few days," he announced. "She's been helping translate for Apache patients at my clinic, providing medical knowledge that probably saved 2 lives. Whatever else you want to say about her, she's been serving this community since the moment she arrived." The momentum was shifting. Thomas could feel the crowd's anger transforming into uncertainty, their absolute certainty cracking under the pressure of more complicated truths. But it was what happened next that truly changed everything. A young Mexican woman pushed through the crowd, carrying a baby and followed by 2 small children. Thomas recognized her as Maria Gonzalez, whose husband worked at the copper mine. "Senora Running Bear," she called out in accented English. "Please, my baby, he is sick again." Sarah immediately moved toward the family, her face creasing with concern. "What are his symptoms, Maria?" "The fever has returned, and he will not eat. Dr. Hamilton gave medicine, but it does not help." Without hesitation, Sarah knelt in the dusty street and examined the baby while 60 hostile citizens watched in fascination. Her hands were gentle and sure as she checked for signs of illness, speaking softly in Spanish to calm the mother's fears. "This is not the same sickness," she diagnosed after a few minutes. "This is something different. Dr. Hamilton, could you bring your bag? I think I know what this is, but I want to be certain before treating him." Dr. Hamilton hurried back to his clinic while Sarah continued examining the child. The crowd had forgotten their anger entirely, drawn into the drama of a sick baby and a woman who clearly knew what she was doing. When Dr. Hamilton returned with his medical bag, Sarah showed him what she had found. "See these small spots behind his ears? And the way he pulls away when we touch his neck? In Apache medicine, we call this spirit sickness, but I believe you call it spinal fever." Dr. Hamilton's face went pale. Spinal fever was often fatal, and early treatment was crucial. "You're right," he confirmed after his own examination. "How did you know?" "My grandmother was a medicine woman. She taught me to recognize many conditions that don't respond to white man's medicine alone. This one requires both traditional and modern treatment working together." For the next hour, Sarah and Dr. Hamilton worked as a team to treat the baby while the entire crowd watched. Sarah provided knowledge of herbs and traditional techniques that complemented Hamilton's medical training, creating a treatment plan that drew from both cultures' understanding of healing. By the time they finished, the baby's fever was breaking and he was nursing normally for the first time in days. "You saved his life," Maria said to Sarah, tears streaming down her face. "How can I thank you?" "By helping others understand that Apache knowledge and white knowledge working together can accomplish what neither can do alone," Sarah replied, glancing meaningfully at the crowd. The transformation was immediate and profound. These weren't abstract principles anymore. This was a sick baby who had been healed by cooperation between cultures, a living demonstration of what Thomas and Sarah had been trying to explain. Mayor Harrison stepped forward, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching shame. "Miss Running Bear," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We judged you based on fear instead of fact, and we nearly drove away someone who could help make our community stronger." "Apology accepted," Sarah replied graciously. "But the real question is what happens next. Thomas and I came here with a vision of cooperation and shared prosperity. Today has shown that such cooperation can work, that it can save lives and solve problems that neither culture could handle alone. The question is whether Silver City is ready to be part of that vision. The crowd that had gathered in anger began to disperse in thoughtful conversation. Small groups formed around Colonel Morrison and Dr. Hamilton and other community leaders, discussing possibilities that had seemed impossible an hour ago. As the street cleared, Thomas and Sarah found themselves standing together outside his bank, hand in hand, watching their neighbors walk away with their minds changed and their hearts opened. "Well," Thomas said with a shaky laugh, "that could have gone worse." "It could have gone better too," Sarah replied, but she was smiling. "We still have a lot of work ahead of us." "Together?" Thomas asked. "Together," Sarah confirmed. The wedding took place 3 months later in a ceremony that was itself a symbol of the new world they were building. Father Martinez came from his mission to perform the service, speaking in English, Spanish, and Apache to accommodate guests from all 3 communities. The reception featured food from multiple traditions, music from mariachi bands and Apache drummers, and dancing that went on until dawn. Colonel Morrison served as Thomas's best man, while Dr. Hamilton's wife stood as Sarah's matron of honor. Even Mayor Harrison attended, bringing a wedding gift and a grudging admission that maybe he'd been wrong about a few things. But the most meaningful moment came during the ceremony itself, when Sarah and Thomas exchanged vows that referenced not just their love for each other, but their commitment to building bridges between worlds. 30 years ago, Thomas said, a little girl made me a promise beside a creek where her family lay dead. She promised to find me again, to show me why our paths had crossed in that terrible and sacred moment. Today I understand. We were brought together not just for our own happiness, but to prove that love is stronger than hate, that understanding is more powerful than fear, and that when people choose courage over comfort, they can change the world. Sarah's response was equally moving. The boy who saved my life 30 years ago grew into a man who saves lives every day, through fair dealing, generous lending, and refusing to accept that differences have to mean divisions. Thomas Mitchell, you are my husband, my partner, and my proof that some promises are worth keeping no matter how long it takes to fulfill them. The wooden horse that had started their correspondence sat on the altar beside them, a symbol of everything they had overcome and everything they still hoped to build. In the years that followed, the partnership between Thomas and Sarah transformed not just their own lives but the entire region. Their bank became a model for inclusive lending that helped Apache families start businesses while providing white ranchers with the capital to modernize their operations. Sarah's cultural knowledge and Thomas's financial expertise created new markets for traditional Apache crafts while introducing modern agricultural techniques to tribal lands. They established the first integrated school in the territory, where Apache and white children learned together, studying both traditional knowledge and modern subjects. Sarah wrote textbooks that preserved Apache history and culture while teaching practical skills for succeeding in the changing world. Their marriage produced 4 children who grew up speaking 3 languages and understanding that their heritage included the best of multiple worlds. These children would become leaders in their own right, carrying forward the vision their parents had pioneered. But, perhaps most importantly, Thomas and Sarah proved that love really could conquer all, that 2 people willing to stand against the world's prejudices could change not just their own lives but the lives of everyone around them. On their 25th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their home overlooking Silver City, Sarah handed Thomas a letter that had arrived that morning from the territorial governor. "Read it aloud," she requested. Thomas opened the letter and began reading. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, it is my honor to inform you that the territorial legislature has voted to establish the Mitchell Running Bear Foundation for Cross-Cultural Education as a permanent institution. Your model of cooperation and shared prosperity has become the standard for community development throughout the Southwest, and your success in proving that integration strengthens rather than weakens our society has influenced territorial policy at the highest levels." Thomas paused, emotion catching in his throat. "Furthermore," he continued, "as we prepare for statehood, we want leaders who understand that our new state's strength will come from including all its peoples in the promise of American opportunity. I would be honored if you would consider serving as our first Director of Native Affairs, a position that would allow you to bring your vision of cooperation and shared prosperity to communities throughout our future state." Sarah smiled, the same expression of quiet satisfaction she'd worn 30 years ago when she'd promised a 12-year-old boy that she would find him again. "What do you think?" she asked. Thomas looked out over the thriving city below them, at the mixed communities they had helped build, at the children playing together in streets where 30 years ago such friendships would have been impossible. "I think," he said, pulling his wife closer, "that some promises are worth keeping no matter how long it takes to fulfill them. And some love stories are meant to change the world." In the distance, the sun was setting over New Mexico territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and copper, the same colors that had blessed the morning when a frightened Apache girl and a compassionate white boy first found each other beside Devil's Creek and proved that kindness could bloom even in the darkest moments, and that love, given time and courage, really could conquer all.